Good morning. My name is Emily Underwood. I'm the Community Initiative Specialist for the Missouri Historical Society. I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning for today's installment of the STL History Live series. This one's called Turning Points in St. Louis LGBTQIA+ History with Ian Darnell and Sharon Smith. The Missouri Historical Society hosts 2 to 3 of these STL History Live programs every week, so be sure to check out the full lineup. You can find that on our website, which is mohistory.org, or you can go to our Missouri History Museum Facebook page and look under the events listings to find that. The next one coming up is this Thursday, May 14th. It's at 6:00 p.m. and it's called Rhythm on the Mississippi, How Riverboats Shaped St. Louis Music in the Early 20th Century. So I hope you can join us for that. Before we get started, I do want to take a moment to express some gratitude. First, I want to say a very big thank you to our members. We really are so appreciative of all of your support now and always. It helps keep programs like this series running. If you're not a member, but you like the things we do and want to learn more about our membership program, you can copy and paste the URL that I put into the chat. It's mohistory.org/support. I also want to recognize the support of the Zoo Museum Tax District with a sincere thank you to everyone in the St. Louis area for your tax contributions. Our program today is going to run about 20 minutes or so, followed by about 10 minutes for Q&A. You can submit questions through that Q&A button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We would appreciate it if you wait until close to the end of the presentation to ask your questions. We do have limited time, but we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. We are also providing closed captioning today, so you should be able to turn that on through your subtitles on through your toolbar as well. I know some people have said they have to click on the More button, so you might have to check there if you're looking for it. And also, if you want to go back at any point and rewatch any of today's presentation or any of the other STL History Live presentations, you can find them all on the Missouri Historical Society's YouTube channel, so check there as well. And finally, at the end of the presentation, we would love to get your feedback. You'll notice at some point during the presentation, there'll be a tab that pops up in your browser, and it'll have a short survey. So don't be fooled, it's not a pop-up, it's supposed to be there, and we would love for you to just take a minute or two of your time to let us know what you think about today's program. So with that, I'm going to make myself scarce and turn it over to our presenters today. So you're going to first hear from Sharon Smith, our Curator of Civic and Personal Identity, and then she's going to pass the baton to Ian Darnell, who's the Curatorial Assistant with our LGBTQIA collection. So take it away, Sharon.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Emily. Before Ian starts, I wanted to say just a few words. We are excited to unveil a new logo, which you see here. Gateway to Pride refers to an initiative that the Missouri Historical Society actually put forth 5 years ago, minus the name. MHS strives to be as inclusive, diverse, and accessible as possible. This initiative speaks to the LGBTQIA+ communities in the St. Louis region. It involves collecting artifacts and stories for exhibits, as well as preserving those materials for researchers and future generations. At the end of the presentation, I will talk a little bit more about what we are looking for and how each of you can help. But now, Ian, it's all yours.
Okay, hello everybody. Again, my name is Ian Darnell and I'm the Curatorial Assistant for LGBTQI Collections at the Missouri Historical Society. Today we are going to look at 5 moments that shape St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history, 5 turning points that help define that history. But a few words of introduction. First of all, it's important to keep in mind that there's still so much that we need to learn about St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history. And that's part of the reason why we have this initiative. We're hoping to collect more of the archival materials, the objects, the video and audio recordings, the photographs, and other materials that will be the raw material for telling these stories and for understanding this history. But we're not starting completely from scratch. Thanks to the hard work of community historians and others over many years, we do have a nice body of archival materials and other items to work with. Many of these stories have been recorded, and there's a decent amount that we do know. So we're sharing some of that with you today. Another important caveat is that these 5 moments are just some of the many turning points that we could have chosen. St. Louis's LGBTQIA+ history is very long, it's rich, it's complicated, and there are many fascinating figures, many important moments, interesting places. So this will just be a taste, just to whet your appetite and to give you a hint at the bigger, more complicated history that we have to explore. And then one final note before we jump in, most of the images that you'll see in the PowerPoint presentation today are items that have already been collected by the Missouri Historical Society. They're items from our collection. So that should give you an idea of some of the sorts of things that we already have, which are things that the curators can use to explore this history, but also things that anyone in the community is welcome to take a look at and to use. And these items should also give you an idea of the sorts of things that we might be interested in collecting. So Sharon will be telling you more about that later. But without any further ado, let's jump in to our first turning point, the publication of The Story of a Life. So I think that oftentimes when people think about LGBTQIA+ history, they're thinking of the relatively recent past. They might think of the Stonewall riots about 50 years ago. They might think of lesbian feminist activism in the 1970s and 80s. They might think of recent controversy over same-sex marriage after the turn of the 21st century. But LGBTQIA history is much longer. In fact, no matter how far back we go, we can find historical records that attest to the existence of people who we would think of today as LGBTQIA+, people who crossed gender boundaries or who troubled ideas of how men and women were supposed to be, or people who loved and desired members of the same sex. And that's as true of St. Louis as it is of anywhere else. In fact, if we go back to the 18th or 19th centuries, we find evidence of people who we would think of today as LGBTQIA+ in St. Louis. And one of the most amazing pieces of this early history is this book, The Story of a Life. It was written by a St. Louisan who wrote using the pseudonym Claude Hartland, and it was published in St. Louis in 1901. And it's widely regarded as one of the first, if not the first, autobiographical books published in the United States by a person who we would understand today as LGBTQIA+. Now, what is tricky is to apply one of our modern labels, a modern term from the LGBTQIA+ alphabet, to identify Hartland. So let's hear him describe how he talked about himself in the preface of the book. He says, "In the following chapters appears the history of a being who has the beard and the well-developed sexual organs of a man, but who is, from almost every other point of view, a woman. He has the delicate, refined taste of a woman, and what is worse, her sexual desires for men." So there's probably a good case to be made that Claude Hartland was a trans woman or a non-binary trans person at the start of the 20th century. However, he, all of his life, presented as male and used male pronouns, he, him, his, to talk about himself. There maybe is a case to be made that he was a gay man, although he speaks of his internal self as being that of a woman or something like a woman, or at least not being conventionally male. Probably the answer is that Claude Hartland was none of those things because he didn't have access to those modern terms. They would be anachronistic. But it is clear that he is a predecessor of LGBTQIA+ people today. So in the book, he talks about growing up in the rural South. He talks about his childhood gender confusion. He talks about falling in love and having sex with men. And then he picks up everything and moves from the country to the big city of St. Louis. It's important to remember that at the start of the 20th century, St. Louis was one of the biggest cities in the country, the fourth biggest city in the country. It was a booming industrial metropolis. And for people who would think of as LGBTQIA+ today, St. Louis offered opportunities to reinvent yourself, to experiment with new ways of life. And we see a little bit of that in Claude Hartland's memoir. And here's an extraordinary picture from the collections of the Missouri Historical Society at the corner of 6th and Olive Street in the 1890s. And in his memoir, Claude Hartland talks about how at that very street corner, at about the same time that this photo was taken, he ran into another person who, as he put it, was affected as he was another person who we might understand today as LGBTQIA+. And they recognized each other, struck up a conversation, and developed a friendship. So imagine going back in time and we have this incredible window on the very beginnings of an LGBTQIA+ community in St. Louis at the dawn of the 20th century. That takes us to our next turning point, St. Louis's Stonewall in 1969. So this is decades after the publication of The Story of a Life, almost 70 years later, and a lot had happened in the meantime. The LGBTQIA+ community that was just coming into being at the start of the 20th century had become much more complicated. It really matured, but it was mostly underground and undercover. That was to a great degree because of the prejudice that LGBTQIA+ people faced. Many people in mainstream society regarded LGBTQIA+ people as sick, that is, mentally ill, and in need of help from medical professionals. Many people regarded LGBTQIA+ people as sinful, that is, immoral and going against the will of God. And also, LGBTQIA+ people were often regarded as criminal. And that is because at the time, just to live as an LGBTQIA+ person often meant breaking the law or risking breaking the law. In 1969 in Missouri, it was illegal to have sex with someone of the same sex. It was illegal in the city of St. Louis to cross-dress, that is, to wear clothes that were regarded to be that of the opposite sex. And effectively speaking, it was illegal to operate or to patronize a bar for gays or lesbians. Now, what's important to know is that LGBTQIA+ people were already beginning to organize for their rights at this time. In fact, going as far back as the 1920s, we have the first example of a gay and lesbian rights organization in the United States, the Society for Human Rights, which was in Chicago. Then, starting in the early 1950s, you have what was called the homophile movement, the small organizations advocating for the rights of gays and lesbians, starting in California and then spreading to cities across the country. There were even some St. Louisans who were members of these early organizations, like the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, and One Incorporated. And this is an incredible piece. I think one of the most interesting pieces in the entire collection, even though it seems very small and simple. This is the membership card of a St. Louisan named Wilbur Wegener, his membership card for the Mattachine Society, which was a pioneering early gay rights organization in the United States. This dates to the early 1960s. Now, what a really important turning point was, though, was the Stonewall Rebellion, also sometimes called the Stonewall Riots or the Stonewall Uprising, in the summer of 1969. Now, what took place then was that police in New York City raided a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. That wasn't so unusual. Like I said, LGBTQIA people regularly faced harassment from the police during this era. But what was different that night was that the people in the bar and in the surrounding neighborhood resisted, and over a series of nights confronted the police. Now, that wasn't the beginnings of the American LGBTQIA+ movement, but it did mark a turning point. It started a new phase of the movement with an increased degree of visibility, of militancy, and of radicalism. Now, what's much less well remembered is that something similar happened in St. Louis at around the same time. So this is a picture from the collections of the Missouri Historical Society of the 3500 block of Olive. It was sort of the Grove before there was the Grove. It was a center of gay and lesbian nightlife in the St. Louis area for many years, from the 1930s all the way to the start of the 1980s. You can see several of the bars that were in operation then, like Shelley's Midway, the Golden Gate, and the Onyx Room at the end of the street. So these bars, as I mentioned, were effectively illegal, but they could remain open if they stayed on the right side of the police and the city government. This sometimes involved bribes, but there was always the danger of police harassment or raids. And that's exactly what happened one evening in 1969, Halloween night to be specific. A group of 9 people exited the Onyx Room bar, and shortly thereafter, they were arrested for dressing in the clothes of the opposite sex for masquerading and taken to police headquarters downtown. Now, this wasn't so unusual, but what was unusual is that an organized community fought back. Not so long before, earlier that year, an organization called the Mandrake Society had been founded in St. Louis, an early gay and lesbian rights organization. It sprang into action that night, and some of its members went to the police station downtown, along with some of the friends of the people who had been arrested that night. And they protested, they demanded that those people be released, and they raised bail. In the aftermath of that night, interest really grew in the Mandrake Society. Many people from the wider community became interested in its mission and began to support it. And the organization hired a lawyer who was able to convince a judge to drop the charges. So again, this isn't exactly the beginning of an LGBTQIA movement in St. Louis, but it marks a new level of militancy, of visibility, and began an era of organizing through the 1970s that made a big long-term impact. That takes us to our next turning point, the first St. Louis celebration of lesbian and gay pride in 1980. So the annual Pride celebrations that so many of us love so much originated in 1970, when people in cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles organized demonstrations and marches to commemorate the first anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising. And that's the start of the annual Pride tradition that continues to this day around the world. St. Louis was a little slower to adopt that tradition. We know that in the early 1980s, not 1980s, but 1970s, there was an automobile parade that was organized in solidarity with other Pride events around the country. And then in the late 1970s, there were Pride events at Washington University and at the Metropolitan Community Church. But what's generally regarded as the first real Pride celebration in St. Louis, the one that really kicked off the tradition here, was in 1980. This was the first time that you had a well-organized series of public events that brought together a pretty wide spectrum of the community. Here are two pieces from the collections of the Missouri Historical Society that document that turning point. One is this t-shirt from the first Pride celebration in 1980. And then we also have this schedule of events, which shows some of the things that were organized. Dances, picnics, film screenings, workshops, all at different locations and sponsored by different community organizations and businesses. Then that week culminated on a Sunday with what was technically called the Walk for Charity, although many people who were involved thought of it as a march. Hundreds of people participated in that event. They began in Maryland Plaza in the Central West End, just by where the Drunken Fish is today. And then they marched down Lindell Boulevard along the northern edge of Forest Park, and then they gathered at Brookings Hall on the campus of Washington University and staged a rally. So that was really a new level of visibility and cohesion for the community and kicked off the Pride traditions that continue to this day, although I suppose things are disrupted because of COVID-19, but hopefully if all goes well, they'll just be delayed this year a bit. That takes us to our next turning point. The AIDS crisis comes to the public's attention in 1981. So I very deliberately said that this is when the AIDS crisis comes to the public's attention. Sometimes people talk about AIDS beginning in the 1980s, but that's misleading. We know that HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus, the virus that causes AIDS, that had been circulating in the population for many years previous to 1981. In fact, St. Louis is the site of one of the earliest identified cases of someone with HIV, a teenager named Robert Rayford, who passed away in 1969, almost 10 years before, actually more than 10 years before the start of the AIDS crisis coming to the public's attention. But what happened in 1981 is that the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention first identified clusters of gay men suffering from a mysterious illness, and the New York Times and other press outlets began reporting on it. So it's really when it comes to the public's attention. So in ensuing years, the rates of HIV climbed dramatically, and very sadly, many people fell sick and died of the illness. And even though anyone, regardless of their gender and sexuality, could be affected, In many ways, it had an especially devastating impact on the LGBTQIA+ community, and especially gay and bisexual men and transgender women. What I'd like to talk about a little are some interesting similarities or parallels between the AIDS crisis and the COVID-19 crisis of today. Now, this is a complicated issue, and we probably really won't be able to understand the similarities and the differences between the two crises until the future when we have more historical perspective, but we can point out a few interesting points of convergence. One, I would say, is that the community comes together in both cases to respond to the crisis. Here are two examples from the archives of the Missouri Historical Society: the founding of St. Louis Effort for AIDS in 1985, and the founding of Blacks Assisting Blacks Against AIDS, or BABA, in 1989. Both of these were organizations that supported those who were affected by the disease, raised awareness about ways to prevent the transmission of HIV, and otherwise responded to the crisis in the community. St. Louis Effort for AIDS still exists in the form of Vivint Health, whereas Blacks Assisting Blacks Against AIDS evolved into the organization Williams and Associates, still in operation today. It's also interesting to note that BABA, Blacks Assisting Blacks Against AIDS, in the mid-1990s started what was called a B-Boy Festival, an annual celebration to build community and to raise awareness about issues related to HIV. That eventually evolved into the Black Pride celebration, still celebrated every year today. Another interesting point of convergence between the COVID-19 crisis and the AIDS crisis was that these were political. It wasn't just a matter of medicine or biology. It made people ask questions about the relationship between the community and the individual, between government and citizens. In both cases, people wondered what an equitable response to the disease looked like. One of the most important manifestations of the politicization of the AIDS crisis was ACT UP, an organization whose name is an acronym standing for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. St. Louis had a chapter, and here are two items from the collection documenting its history. This is a flyer from the founding meeting of ACT UP St. Louis in 1990. It was held at the Sunshine Inn restaurant in the Central West End. And then this is one of the most remarkable items in the entire collection. It's a foam core coffin that members of ACT UP used in demonstrations and marches here in St. Louis. So this shows how the crisis became political and a rallying point and even generated protests and really redefined LGBTQI politics. Now that brings us to our last turning point, the last moment we'll be talking about today, the creation of the Transgender Memorial Garden in 2015. So relatively recently, this slide will take us up to the present day, almost. So the Metro Trans Umbrella Group is an organization that supports and advocates for transgender people in the St. Louis area. It was founded in 2013. In 2015, members of the Metro Trans Umbrella Group and supporters and allies got together to transform what had been a vacant lot in the Grove neighborhood near Vandevetter and Hunt, and to turn it into a garden with flowers and trees and benches and a sign. The garden's purpose was to memorialize transgender victims of violence, particularly of hate crimes, but also to celebrate transgender lives and to serve as a gathering point for the community. It was dedicated in November of 2015 during the Trans Day of Remembrance. And here's a photo from our friends at Boom Magazine from that day. Since then, the Trans Memorial Garden has been a place where the community has gathered both to celebrate and to mourn. For instance, in the aftermath of the massacre at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. This is where St. Louisans gathered to mourn that tragic event. And it remains a place every year where people gather to mark the Transgender Day of Remembrance. I'm happy to report that recently we've been able to gather many more artifacts that document the rich history of transgender activism in the St. Louis area. Here are two examples. This is a flag that a local transgender woman named Lily Shoto created. On it, she wrote the names of transgender victims of violence, and she brought them to demonstrations and this flag to demonstrations and protests in St. Louis, including Transgender Day of Remembrance ceremonies at the Transgender Memorial Garden. And then here is a ribbon that was distributed at the Transgender Day of Remembrance ceremony just this past November. So examples of some items that we've been collecting recently. I think that's a good way to pass things off to Sharon to talk about the collection.
Thanks, Ian. So here is where you come in. We want to be able to tell and preserve the stories of the LGBTQIA+ communities in St. Louis for years to come. As you've seen, there is a rich history here, just waiting to be told. We have a major exhibition planned for 2024, but museums need artifacts for exhibits. Museums also collect materials for researchers, and we document all the aspects of St. Louis's history. What you see on this slide is a wish list of the types of artifacts we are seeking and examples of topics we are wanting to explore. And there are more, of course. This is really, just the beginning, and you will help us. The email listed here is a dedicated email just set up for this project, and it will come to Ian and to myself. We hope in the coming months to be able to actually meet with folks in person, face to face, and bring collections into the museum. However, for now, we can certainly start that conversation via this email. You can send us your photos of what you have. You can share your stories about those objects. We had hoped to do a launch of the Gateway to Pride initiative with a small installation in the museum this summer. But due to COVID-19, we had to move that to a virtual piece that will come out hopefully this fall. So stay tuned for that. And please feel free to contact us at gatewaytopride@mohistory.org with any questions, comments, or donations. We will always look forward to hearing from you, and we hope to have these conversations really be a meaningful opportunity for the Missouri Historical Society and the way that we can now share the story of this amazing community and its rich history with the folks who come to the Missouri Historical Society. With that, I think we're ready for some questions.
So someone asked about lesbian history. Sharon, maybe you could talk about some of the things that we recently collected that have to do with lesbian history in the St. Louis area.
Yeah, so we are, there are some really fun things that we're beginning to bring into the collection. We talked with folks who explored and who actually began the Wired Women organization that many of you might remember. So we have materials from them. We hope to get some oral histories with them. We tried. We've had several issues, but that's another story for another day because of all of the COVID and the weather and everything. But Wired Women, we have materials related to the women's professional softball team, the Hummers. And many of their, some of their people are still here. Some of the players are still here. And so we're excited about that. Music festivals, not so much. We have, of course, things with CARIS, the St. Louis Women's Chorus. And then politics, yes, we also have Jeanette Mott Oxford's collection. As you know, Jeanette Mott Oxford was the first open lesbian who was appointed and elected to serve in Jeff City. So some really amazing thing with women's history, and we can thank somebody by the name of Betty Neely for some of that. Well, I'll take the next one, although I think we can, either one of us can speak to this. Ian, they're wondering about showing video in the exhibit. Yes, certainly in the larger exhibit. Now, again, with the initiative that we were going to show in the atrium, and now that will become part of the virtual experience in the fall, we will hope to have some of that too, and we can probably embed a little bit more of that kind of thing. So, you know, if we're looking at video pieces that people have, as well as oral histories that we'll be conducting, that mostly Ian will be doing over the summer, hopefully, some remotely, some hopefully in person, we'll be embedding a lot of that in there, yes. Let me speak to this one, and then Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you. So let me speak to the one about what sparked the creation of this project. And it says, it is amazing and thank you for your work. Well, we do appreciate everybody's efforts on this. The creation of this project really began because, as I said, the Missouri Historical Society is interested in being as diverse and inclusive and accessible as possible. And our tagline is "Find yourself here." And the LGBTQIA+ communities are now going to find themselves here, because we are doing this project specifically because our story needs to be told. And our story is one that is rich, rich, rich and diverse. And so that was the spark of the creation. And hopefully we will have some things in the near future, programming wise, as well as this virtual exhibit, that will prompt that even more.
So someone asked, how do you identify early examples of LGBTQIA+ artifacts or writings in the collection as actually being a part of this history? Now that's really tricky. There are all sorts of challenges to doing LGBTQIA history in the early 20th century, the 19th century and before. And part of that is the trouble of not being able to use modern labels to understand how people were identifying themselves. Another source of trouble is the widespread prejudice and misunderstanding that LGBTQIA people faced in the past, which means that often they avoided making an impact on the historical record, or the only historical records that might survive are things like police reports or the writings of psychologists who interpreted LGBTQIA+ people as criminal or as sick. So those are serious challenges, and sometimes they're insurmountable. But with some detective work and reading between the lines, we can sometimes uncover the voices of LGBTQIA people. For instance, in some private diary entries or letters, in some reportage in the press. So there are sources to be found. It just, you have to tread carefully and be creative.
There's a question about copying VCR tapes and returning them. So, you know, yes, I guess the quick answer to that is yes, we can do that. We often like to have the original pieces with us in the collection. And the reason for that is because that's the preservation copy, right? I mean, that's the original piece. And then we do make a preservation. We will digitize anything that's of an older style medium. And so that then we can use the digital version in whatever we do, whether it's an exhibit, postings, what have you. But we like to keep the original just because somebody should have that, right? And we are a great repository for those things. But that said, we can also give the donor a digital copy of the VCR tape, which maybe is an actual better opportunity, but we can certainly talk about that as a case by case as they come in. Is it possible for you to do a series of short posts with videos and photos on a more regular basis leading up to the 2024 exhibit? Absolutely. I think, you know, we'll talk a bit more as we move forward. You know, we're sort of reinventing this whole idea of doing things virtually now, and I have to admit, getting fairly comfortable. It's still a challenge, but I think as we move forward, those things will happen more and more. And as we get more and more things in, we can share those things more and more. We have to also think about anonymity sometimes, and we know with this group of communities, we are exploring how we do things with an eye to being sure that we aren't doing anything that somebody doesn't want us to do. So certainly we'll have those conversations, and anybody can feel free to talk to us through that email as well about how they would want us to present those things. Oh, I don't know about the next question. I'm not sure I know the answer. It's a good one. The question is, please talk about LGBTQ couples, and others putting the Missouri History Museum in our will and estate planning. I think that's for our development team, but certainly we have an answer for that. I'm just not sure what it is, but certainly you can do that, and we will get back to you on that one as well. I think that's a great opportunity.
Someone asked, are there materials dealing with radical fairies in St. Louis? So that was, radical fairies are a group of queer men who sort of radically rethink gender. And to the best of my knowledge, we haven't collected anything related to the Nautical Ferries in St. Louis. So if you have any materials that you'd be interested in sharing, or you know places where we could look, people we could reach out to, we'd be very interested.
I'm getting a comment that maybe we have room for or time for one more question. I'm actually going to say two. So I'm going to talk to the first one here, the spirit of diversity. Have there been any outreach to the Latinx and Asian LGBTQIA communities here in St. Louis? And, you know, we were just getting started as we were all sort of dispersed to our homes. So intentionally not the case, but not quite so much yet. However, we had hoped that with that Atrium experience this summer, that there was going to be some of that included. So it's to say that we will, and yes, we want to. So it's out there now, and I hope that people from every form of the LGBTQIA plus community, every part of it, every aspect of it, will understand that we want to tell all those stories. And so yes, the question is the answer is yes, we do want to explore all of those communities, including Latinx and Asian. And then lastly, the request was that we might, the question about how the initiative got started, there, it feels a little odd, but it was certain aspects of the staff who really started this this idea of the collecting initiative. And I think that it's important that we know that the History Museum has been behind this initiative for years. This is not something new. It's not something that's trendy. We really announced this way back and started thinking about it in 2013, and it officially became an initiative in 2015. So I really want to applaud all of the folks at the History Museum. I've been around a long time, and it's been amazing to watch us get to this point where we're actually doing something like this on a Zoom meeting. And the fact that we've been able to bring Ian in and have him be a real expert in this field is also telling to where the History Museum is on this. So I'm not sure what else we need to do, Emily. Do we have more time, or? Is Emily there?
Yes, I am. I was unmuting myself.
Okay.
We are about out of time. I did want to ask, I know some people had some very specific questions about things they would like to donate. I believe that we may be able to reach back to them individually to answer those questions. But if we can forward the slide. There we go. So you can see all the next ones coming up. I just want to say thank you so much to Ian and to Sharon too, and our captioner Steve today. And a big thanks to all of you who are watching today. Your feedback's always important, so don't forget to look for that survey that should have popped up in a separate tab in your browser. Again, it should just take a couple of minutes of your time. So thank you in advance for helping us with that. Thanks again for being here. And hopefully we'll see you again soon. We'll see you next time. Thank you all so much.
So much.